Hello and welcome to the Power to the People Forum. My name is Tanya Ha. I'm a science journalist and sustainability researcher, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's forum. The Power to the People Forum is part of a suite of online forums that will be held over the coming months as part of the Research to Drive Change project from the Bushfire CRC. Some of you will have seen the Bushfire CRC's past webinars in which bushfire researchers have presented their findings. This is now our third forum-style webinar. This new webcasting platform allows us to be more interactive than a traditional webinar, with online polls and an opportunity for questions with our presenters. And there'll be call presentations as well from researchers. Now, a brief overview of today's forum. The focus is on community involvement and shared responsibility in bushfire management decision-making. We'll start off with an introductory video, followed by 3 research presentations and some discussion with a lead end user. Along the way, there'll be online polls and there'll be opportunities for discussion. Now, for those who are new to this online platform, I'll quickly introduce you to this online environment. Now, the main parts are fairly self-explanatory. In the centre panel that you see here, you'll see the main slideshows as the presenters talk through their research findings. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the presenters, like myself, appearing via webcam. But I'd also like to draw your attention to the bottom left-hand corner there. You'll see a comments box and a window. It has a small talking bubble in the top left corner. That's where you can enter your comments and you can see discussion as we go through today's presentations. So if you have comments that you'd like to make or questions that you'd like to ask the presenters, do feel free to type your comments and questions into that dialog box, again, that you see at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Now, one thing I want you to note is that our voices are coming via phone lines and the vision is coming via the internet. Now, we do this to have optimal clarity in what you see and hear, but without adding too much to the bandwidth. But one of the consequences is that sometimes our voices can be out of sync with what you see, depending on the speed of your web connection and other technical things. Do bear with us, it's part of the online environment, but we hope that the research will shine through and grab your attention. If anyone does have technical difficulties, they can contact the hotline on 1800 733 416. That's 1800 733 416 and tech support will assist. Now, today's forum will be recorded and it will also be available on the Bushfire CRC website in a few days' time. So if you have colleagues that you think might have been interested in today's proceedings, do let them know and direct them to the Bushfire CRC website. Also, our last Research to Drive Change forums on economic tools for bushfire management and also on modelling are now available on the Bushfire CRC website. Thanks also to the people who've already sent in their questions. We will address those during today's proceedings. Now, to start off, it gives my great pleasure to introduce who we're hearing from today. We'll hear from Dr. Blythe McLennan, who's from RMIT, from Dr. Michael Eburn from ANU, Professor Barbara Norman from the University of Canberra, and Mick, our lead end user from the Country Fire Service in South Australia. We'll hear more from them shortly, but in the interest of starting to get more interactive, we're going to start off with a poll question. Now, we're going to ask you, how much do you think you understand about shared responsibility and the way bushfire risk is incorporated into legislative frameworks and policy and planning processes? So click 1 for nothing, 2 for little, 3 for a fair bit, or 4 for a lot. So it appears that a few of you know a little bit, some a fair bit. So we'll leave the poll there. It shows that there's some room to learn more, which is very much the theme of today's event. Now, before we hear from the presenters, we're going to hear a short video that introduces the concepts that we're going to hear about today. It's an overview of research undertaken about shared responsibility and the way fire risk is incorporated into legislative frameworks and policy and planning processes. And it contains interviews with the researchers and our lead end user that you'll be hearing from today.
If you want to raise human safety to the very top of the tree and say that is the absolute overriding factor, you're going to create an environment that's very different to the one we live in now. Both the natural environment, but also the socio-political environment, the society we live in, will be very different. And I think you can draw an analogy with motorcycle riding. Right? Lots of people would say it's far too dangerous and would never do it, and that's fine, they don't have to. And lots of other people go, sure, it's dangerous, it's far more dangerous than driving a car, but it's good fun and it's cheap and there are a whole lot of benefits in it, and I choose to exercise my right to have those benefits. Now, the motorcycle rider who then goes off and dies in a motor vehicle accident doesn't mean there's been a policy failure. So equally, we need to live in regional Australia. We don't want everybody to live in Melbourne and Sydney. And what we have to accept is that the presence of fires and floods, even tragic, fatal ones, doesn't necessarily represent a failure. Our thesis is that that's a matter for community debate. That's part of this whole development of shared responsibilities. People have to ask, what is the cost they're willing to bear for the society they want to live in?
One of the special case studies in this research was on the south coast of New South Wales, which really highlighted the issues of increasing urban development in our coastal environments. It raised the issues of these increasing tensions between demand for not only holiday makers but more and more people living there permanently. One of the key messages, probably not surprisingly, but it came from these focus groups, was how important engagement of the community is and how important this much stronger partnership between those different areas. People who are involved in emergency management on the ground, people making decisions about where future urban development is and will possibly be rebuilt after the event, and the needs and behavioural issues as well as part of that, of the local residents.
We talk about shared responsibility often as we need to do something or they need to do something, so we focus on the end result. But in making decisions about sharing responsibility, we're really talking about a governance process of decision making. The implication of our project is that we need to engage in a more inclusive governance process around emergency management, of involving all those people that we are sharing responsibility with to help understand what are the problems with responsibility sharing now and thus what needs to be fixed. We don't have, say, a widget to hand over to say this is the thing, or a solution or a model or a package to say you can now take this and implement something. So the way that our project influences is to influence thinking, and it's very hard to pin down how you do that. So we're talking about disaster governance, which is higher level and more encompassing than community engagement. You can't decide what that problem is separately and then go out and engage with, say, community members to put a solution to that problem in place when they have a different idea of what the problem is. So you need to have that discussion at the beginning of the process about what you're trying to achieve back further. There are very real barriers to agencies giving or sharing control because it's accepting more risk, and yet they are the ones who have to step up and be accountable at the moment in the current system that we have when events happen and things go wrong.
I think that some of the legislation in Australia can actually be tailored as a result of the Bushfire CRC research to actually identify more clearly what the objectives are of by the community and government, and to give a clearer and a better picture for the emergency services as to what actually defines a successful outcome. We may need to trade off property loss to save life, for instance, and that may be a particularly desirable outcome if the community has thought about it beforehand and has agreed that they would rather see no loss of life at the risk of losing some property. And they're the sorts of issues that we're dealing with through this Bushfire CRC research.
I think the national strategy is pointing out what we want is informed communities who make their own, who understand their own risk. We don't yet know, though, how much we're prepared to let people live with that risk and make choices that governments would prefer they didn't make. That's the debate that's sort of hidden in the national strategy or behind the national strategy, but I think that's the debate that's got to be had. And until you have it, the legal response becomes problematic.
And thank you, Bushfire CRC, for that video. It highlights the importance of bringing community with government and with organisations and with bushfire management. If anyone did have trouble viewing that video, it is available online via the Bushfire CRC website. And in the comments box at the bottom left-hand of the screen, I have posted a link to where that video is available. Do let your colleagues know about those videos as well, because they're a great little summary of some of the research that's happening in the field. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. So bear with me a moment while the slides catch up with me. Okay. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Blythe McLennan from RMIT University. Blythe will now present on sharing responsibility, and reiterating to the audience, do feel free to send in your comments or questions via the comments box. Thank you, Blythe.
Thanks, Tanya. Okay, I just wanted to really talk about two simple things to keep it as brief as possible. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the logic that was underpinning our approach in our research project, because it says a lot, it goes a long way to explain about what we did and how we did it, and also then just to talk about some research outcomes. I just wanted to quickly say as well, the volume on my phone isn't great, so if you're having trouble hearing me, please just put in the chat box, speak up, and I'll try to project a little bit louder. So I think where we're at with shared responsibility is that it's a good idea. It's widely supported as an important goal in emergency management circles. But as a policy idea, there's something really important missing about it, and that's the answer to this question, which is what is wrong and what needs fixing. So we've got calls to focus on shared responsibility, but nothing that's too helpful in working out how to go about doing it, because we haven't really pinned down what the problem is with the way responsibility is shared currently, and therefore what needs to change and how we might go about doing that. So our project was looking at interrogating that idea and examining that question of, well, what's the problem with it currently? So this is, if you look at sort of a simplified policy cycle here, when you're looking at questions around what problems we're trying to address, a different area of research than is more familiar in emergency management circles. So I would say most emergency management research is focused more on the implementation phase of a policy cycle, so helping people to do what they do better and overcome problems they have in implementation. Whereas our project is right back at the beginning, focused on agenda setting, so identifying issues and setting objectives. So what is it that we're trying to do, and how do we understand what the challenges are that we're facing? The trick with this, however, that there isn't just one way to define what the issues are in a policy area, and this is particularly the case for shared responsibility. There are various ways to define what the problem really is with shared responsibility now, and therefore what needs to be done about it, how and by who, and that's the challenge in this research. So with research that's focused on agenda setting as well, the research outcomes look quite different to the outcomes you'd be more familiar with in research that's focused on implementation. So I've picked out sort of what I think are 5 key research outcomes. I'm just going to run through them fairly briefly and not explain them in great detail, just to leave them there. And I hope people will ask me questions about them and to elaborate on them a little bit later. So the first outcome, I think, is very simple but very important. Our project raised awareness of the issues we have with problem definition in sharing responsibility, and particularly that we're not all necessarily talking about the same thing. When we talk about shared responsibility, we use the same words, it rolls off our tongues easily, but different stakeholders and different people might be thinking about different kinds of challenges when they use that word. And I think that is important. A realisation of that is quite an important outcome.
Another outcome is that we identify types of responsibility sharing problems, and this came through examination of research that looked at risk management and also looking at responsibility sharing problems that were raised in public submissions for the Royal Commission. There are multiple ways, multiple kinds of problems that people identify with responsibility coexisting at the same time. So there are multiple ways to define problems and understand what's at the crux of it, but there are also problems in different areas of risk management coexisting. So we're not just talking about one straightforward, clearly defined problem that we can go out and fix. We also identify diverse ways to shape responsibilities. So these are things that alter how responsibilities are shared, and they vary from very interventionist, formal ways like implementing laws, down to more informal or more collaborative ways, so like participatory decision-making processes, down to more informal things like changes in social norms in society. The fourth outcome, we've provided some evidence for change makers, and particularly the need for more inclusive governance in emergency management. Inclusive governance being governance that involves a broader range of areas of society in all of those phases of policy making. So not just implementation, but also right from agenda setting right through. And somebody please ask me more about that. I'd love to talk about that some more. And the fifth is quite a broad but important outcome. We've connected some of the debates in emergency management in Australia with broader socio-political debates that are going on around risk and responsibility internationally. And that's important because there's a lot of thinking out there that we can incorporate and learn from and draw on in emergency management in Australia that I don't think we have been able to, that we have connected with enough in the past. So we've tried to connect with some of that and bring some of those debates in to contribute to our thinking in emergency management. So I'll leave it there. I think hopefully I've raised a few issues that will give people some questions to ask. Thank you very much, and back to you, Tanya.
Thanks, Blythe. We do have a question that came through from Jill, and it was during the video, but I think, Blythe, you can answer this. Jill asks, I'm interested in the use of the word we. We need to influence thinking. We need to engage the community. Who is we?
I'm pretty sure when Jill wrote that it was in response to something I was saying in the video, most likely. I use the word we a lot. That is a lot because the kinds of issues we're looking at are need a collective response to them. Who we is can change. When I'm using the term we, I'm not as precise with it as I probably should be, but I'm talking about stakeholders of emergency management. And the way our projects are set up, we have researchers and our end users. So I'm often talking about researchers and end users, which is emergency management agencies. So when we need to influence thinking, I think I'm talking about the researchers more specifically, and we need to engage the community is the research and our end users, so emergency service agencies.
We've got another question that was sent through earlier from Kay. How do concepts of shared responsibility link to bushfire risk, particularly for property owners needing to adapt these ideas and act on them?
That's a good question, and it's a difficult one to answer with a short, sharp response, sorry. But a lot of my answers to questions about shared responsibility begin with it depends, because we're starting with this idea that there are different ways to understand what the issues, the underlying challenges are with shared responsibility. So the answer to that question depends on what you think the crux of the shared responsibility problem is. So if you think the problem with sharing responsibility in bushfire risk at the moment is that householders are too reliant on fire authorities and need to take more personal responsibility, your answer to that question is going to be different than if you think the crux of it is that property holders don't have access to the resources they need to be able to share responsibility. Therefore, the answer to that question might be you're talking about enabling that through providing resources, whether that's information or economic resources. So, not a succinct answer, sorry, but you really got to take it back to what do we mean by shared responsibility before you can then look at what are the implications for applying it to
particular question.
Were there any particular difficulties in undertaking the research? Any barriers that made it hard?
Research on a problem when the problem is defining the problem. It's a bit of an ethereal, abstract kind of notion, which makes it a bit hard to produce sort of actionable, definable, actionable outcomes for end users. Another challenge we had is that emergency management is a very varied field made up of lots of different activities and goals, and shared responsibility is applied differently at different levels and depending on which activities and goals you're talking about. So we're trying to look into this idea in a way that is not too prescriptive and not too blueprint, but is also relevant across the range of contexts where it can influence thinking and action.
That has to be flexible.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Blythe. I think that's all we've got time for. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our second presenter. We're now going to hear from Michael Eburn, who's from the College of Law and the Furness School of Environment and Society at the ANU. Take it away, Michael.
Thanks, Tanya, and thanks, Blythe. Our project was on the impact of law and policy, or mainstreaming law and policy in emergency management, and the three projects that are presented today are all related. So what I'm going to say in this presentation will have links certainly to what Blythe has just been talking about. So our project aims, as summarised in this first slide, it was axiomatic that emergency management is a whole government cross-sectoral challenge, needs to be a mainstream issue, and we were asked, or we're asking, how does law impact upon emergency management, in particular the emergency services? As Blythe just said, emergency management is a very broad field. There are lots of people in it, lots of things that are being done outside the traditional emergency management organisations is part of it. So local governments in their planning departments, as Barbara's going to talk about shortly, might not realise they're in emergency management, but they are. But our focus was on the emergency services in particular. So we have two keynote publications that came out of the project, sort of one at the beginning and one towards the end, but they bookended the project. And part of the problem, and as Blythe just said, part of the problem is actually defining the problem, what's wrong and what needs fixing. And lots of people report that part of the problem is the law. If only the law was different, they could do something or other to improve their resilience. So we looked at the literature review and evidence for the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, where people raised this sort of argument. And if we're going to mainstream law, and then it needs to be, emergency management needs to be built into various concepts. And what we discovered is that it largely is. The law is actually much more tolerant and sensible than people usually give it credit for. So issues of emergency management and risk management might well be built into the law, but what might be a matter of disagreement is how strongly it is. Is risk management or preventing risk or reducing risk the absolute dominant consideration, or is it just one factor to be considered amongst many? So if you take into account the development, and I'm sure Barbara will be talking about this, and whether you should build in a particular area, well, if you put risk management at the very top of the tree, you might say no, but if you say, well, that's one thing to be considered along with the economic benefit and various other things, it becomes less significant. So that became the issue. It's not really about whether emergency management is a relevant consideration, but it's how strongly relevant it is. Now, our second paper, which we've cited there, also turned on issues that come up, and particularly in the emergency services sector, is this fear of litigation. We're all going to get sued, as if you can't do anything because somebody's going to take legal action and it will all become terribly unpopular. Well, we actually looked into that and discovered that, in fact, there's very little litigation arising out of this context. Certainly the emergency services get sued very rarely, given how often they actually turn out and do stuff. So there's a real fear of the law, but it's much bigger than the actual risk. Now that left us with a bit of a problem. If the issue we were meant to be exploring is what do we need to do to the law to make emergency management better or more mainstream, and we kept saying, well, you know, I'm not sure it's actually that's the problem. Where did we go? I think that also ties back to what Blythe was just telling us about The real issue is how you frame the problem. What's wrong and what needs fixing. So our conclusions were, there is room for mainstreaming. Emergency management is relevant, whether you're looking at land use planning laws or whether you're looking at work health and safety laws or whether you're looking at any number of laws. Whether people think it's strong enough, whether they think it gets the priority it should deserve is a different issue. But it's not one a lawyer particularly can answer. That's a political problem. So the law per se is not the problem. The problem is identifying what we want to achieve. We ask then the question, so what are the measures of success? How do we balance competing interests and priorities? And I think that can be summed up. Well, now hang on, let me come to that. So that's what we came up with. So part of the problem with this is we don't actually necessarily know what we're trying to achieve or how we've achieved it. Now this links to the other projects we're hearing about. It links to planning because you've got to know what you want to achieve. Do you want to guarantee that everybody is safe or do you want to compromise for economic development? And it links to the project that Blythe was just telling us about governance. Because is our objective, for example, to ensure that everybody is safe? If that's true, then you're going to have a very different governance picture. You might have very rigid rules and laws and requiring people to do things. Or do you want to have a system where people are making informed decisions, in which case you're going to have a very different governance and legal picture? And as a lawyer and law researchers, we don't think we can give that answer. What we think needs to be borne in mind is the law isn't necessarily a barrier. It's a tool. Once we've had the arguments, once we've gone through the sorts of things that need to be discussed about how we're going to share responsibility and what it might look like, then we can come back and use the law to facilitate those processes. You can't use the law up front to necessarily work out what shared responsibility should look like. So I suppose our concluding point of this research was, as I said, the law is there, it provides mainstreaming, but until you know what you want to achieve, we can't begin to answer what the law should look like. That's leading us into some future questions which we're asking about. What are the legal barriers to allowing increased community involvement? So again, if we come back to what Blythe was talking about, if we want greater community involvement, if we want a new governance structure, if we want people to be empowered more, how can we tailor the law and the current legal systems to do that? Are there perverse incentives in current governance to discourage resilience? So again, that will depend on how we see resilience and how we see shared responsibility, but are our current arrangements in fact encouraging people not to develop their own resilience or share responsibility? And how do we do a better job of identifying lessons without always letting it fall into a legal dispute? Now, as I said, actually it doesn't come up in law very often. People don't actually get sued, but we all know the Royal Commission model, the coroner's model. They might try to avoid being adversarial, but they tend to fall into it. So we want to look to see if there's a better way to do that. So that was our conclusions. A bit surprising, I think. People wanted us to come up and say, look, the section something or other of this act is a problem and you should take it away and the world will be a better place. That's not what we found. And so I think we share the fundamental question that Blythe put up with, is we're not quite sure what's wrong and what needs fixing. And until the community engages in that, debates that, comes to some conclusions, then it's hard to say how we should use the law to meet those objectives. Back to you, Tanya.
Thanks, Michael. I'm curious to know, how did this compare with experiences overseas and other research that has been done to date?
Oh, I think it's fairly universal. I think part of the problem is you often get people who are doing research, if I think of the literature that I've read, where they've already got a view of what it should be. So they're going to write a paper that says we need to do X, Y, and Z. If you think of the Americans, a whole issue with their national flood program or something, to achieve some other objective, but they're in fact defining the objective. What you don't see is a lot of people going out and asking the community first. And that's something we've tried to avoid. We didn't want to sit up here and tell the world what their world should look like. We want to find that out. And that's why we're working, of course, with Barbara and Blythe to try and bring that through as a multidisciplinary approach.
Do you think the timing of those questions makes a difference? Because I imagine questions about legal implications during, as an exercise in prevention and shared responsibility before an event is quite different to the mindset, the emotional state that people are in after an event has happened.
Oh,
do you think, does that factor into it?
Absolutely. I mean, you hear the discussion when there's been a terrible event and people are suddenly asking who's responsible for it. Well, of course people do that when they're traumatised and grieving and terrible things have happened. And then in the cold light of day, all these conversations change, because in the cold light of day, when there's no disaster imminent, people have a very different view of shared responsibility and risk. People might well say, well, I'm perfectly happy to live here in the bush and run the risk of a bushfire, but it's quite a different view when it's just come through. I think that's part of the problem in this whole sector. Attitudes change, and like any problem, sometimes it's at the forefront of people's minds and sometimes it isn't. You can already see it. After the Black Saturday fires, lots of moves to, recommendations to buy back high-risk properties and all sorts of things. And nowadays people are wanting a bit more, oh no, but I want to be able to live here, I want the freedom. People's attitudes change over time.
We have a question that David has sent through, and bear with me, it's a long question.
It is a long one, yeah.
Blythe mentions having discussions about agreeing on shared responsibilities with stakeholders. When disasters happen, stakeholders may change their expectations or accepted responsibilities depending on the scale or impact, i.e. if there is no loss of life, the loss of property is focused on. Where there is no loss of property, then the response may focus on lack of preventative measures, etc. How do we meet those flexible responsibilities once they have been agreed on? Good question, David.
Given that Blythe's not off, I'm assuming that's a question that's appropriate for me to answer. And I think that's a really difficult problem, and I think that's part of the problem with this whole idea of these new governance arrangements. Because some of the literature on the new governance arrangements, using that as a catchphrase, that the appropriate governance arrangements, want low-tiered, no particular person with power to direct people, and that the community will negotiate these things. This is one of the questions that we want to look at in our ongoing research of how do you deal with what I call the outlier. You might sit around and have a community that all comes together, that agrees on how they're going to share responsibility and who's responsible for what, and you get one individual who goes, well, I'm not, I don't accept that. And in our society, people are pretty much free to do that. So I think that's a really difficult question. And you also, of course, get different stakeholders. Stakeholders may agree, who's responsible for what, and then the fire comes through, there's loss, and a different group of people take a different view. They often get sort of lumped in as the community. Oh, they wanted this and now they want that. We have to try and distinguish that different people at different times have different objectives. But that really is a difficult problem. How are we going to, if there's an agreement in a community about what shared responsibility is, actually make sure people adhere to that? And governments, particularly politicians, despite the rhetoric, you might say, for example, in a very simple model, shared responsibility, provided you know the risk, you can run it, but it's your problem. So we're going to make sure you have lots of information about the risk. You understand you live in a bushfire area, you want to build there, go for it, that's your problem. The house burns down. It's then very hard for a politician to say, we told you so, we're not coming to help. These things will always change, I think, once the event occurs. I don't know there's an answer to that, but that is, I might add, something that we're continuing to look at.
Yeah. One more question from Helen. Are there any examples of this level of community engagement yet?
Look, there are. That's not something I would feel particularly confident in answering, but certainly if you look at the Bushfire CRC research, they produce lots and lots of fire notes and discussions about, and the fire services themselves, they all have community engagement officers. There are people out there, and local governments are doing it. There's a huge amount of that going on, but it's not something I can particularly comment on.
I might do something a little unconventional and see, Laura, could we bring Blythe back to the screen? I'm going from the schedule. Blythe is ready to answer that question. Take it away, Blythe.
Yeah, let me just scroll back. Okay, so I just wanted to respond to Helen's question about the examples of this level of community engagement. I had a couple of responses to that. The first is, I don't think we're just talking about community engagement. Going back to that policy cycle, if community engagement, the way we seem to envision it in emergency management, is really engaging with community at that implementation phase of the cycle.
where we've decided what issues are, we've formulated options, decided amongst them, we're going into implementation, and we go out to engage with the community. I'm using we again then, Jill. Engage with the community about how to get that program or to get that implementation underway. When we talk about inclusive governance, we're talking about involving government and citizens interacting in all phases of that policy cycle. So also back at that question that Michael was talking about of what's the problem, what do we need to change, what are we trying to achieve, and have citizen influence on back at that agenda setting phase as well. And so that's more than community engagement. But to go on to examples, there's different levels or different scales at which you engage on these kinds of issues. You could, small scale, so one example, at a community level is Be Ready Warrandyte program, where there's a management committee of a community-led preparedness program that involves emergency managers in local government, CFA, fire captains and community safety people, community fire guard leaders, etc., collectively overseeing a local level program to address fire preparedness problems in that community. At a more sector-wide level, something I'd really love to see happen, we don't have forums where emergency management professionals and citizen groups can come together to discuss these kinds of issues, to discuss responsibilities broadly. We've got a lot of good forums for, particularly through AFAC, for people who work within emergency management to come together and have shared learnings and understandings and develop shared positions, but not to engage more broadly than that. I would love to see some kind of more broader forum at a sector level develop. I think that would be a great example as well.
Okay. Well, while we've got you there, Blythe, we've got another question that I wanted to direct to you. Simon in the audience, I think we'll save up your question for later because our next speaker is talking on planning. But in the meantime, Blythe, Sanara has asked, isn't part of the problem that we promote shared responsibility, not personal responsibility, particularly in the preparedness stage?
Okay, I actually found some really interesting research around that. When you're talking about government and citizens sharing responsibility, you actually find that when citizens without government agents or representatives stepping up to take their responsibility, they don't feel a personal responsibility as well, so it's negotiated. So, and when citizens don't feel that there is a space for them to influence, they will step back and not take personal responsibility. So which is kind of flipping that question around a little on its head. Yes, you can promote personal responsibility, but that is negotiated with the other people that you're sharing with. So the two go together.
Thanks for that, Blythe, and thank you, Michael. That's all we've got time for on that section, but we'll keep these guys on standby because they seem to be quite handy at jumping in where we need them for questions. But look, it gives me great pleasure to thank those guys and move on to our next speaker, which is Professor Barbara Norman from the University of Canberra. Barbara will now be talking about urban and regional planning systems, and again we encourage you to send through your questions. Simon will be dealing with yours first up at the end of the presentation. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Tanya. And you'll see some common themes coming through this presentation from the first two presentations, particularly around governance and risk and management. So the role of urban and regional planning in relation to managing bushfire risk is the focus of this research. Had four major components. The first was reviewing 16 large national inquiries since 1939 and looking at the outcomes of those in relation to planning. The second was 4 focus groups, one on the south coast of New South Wales, one in Canberra, one in the Mornington Peninsula, and one in Darwin. The third was around particularly looking at the emerging area of fire on the coast as opposed to coastal inundation and floods. And the fourth was about what can we do about capacity building and education and training. So we had 10, just very quickly, 10 research findings. I'm very happy to answer any questions on these afterwards. Clearly, spatial planning or urban and regional planning does have a very significant role in making decisions about the type and location of development. So that's the absolute direct connection with managing the risk from fire or the impact of fire on human settlement. Out of the 16 major bushfire inquiries, the first time that planning was really mentioned was in 1939. So it's not an issue that's suddenly arisen in recent national inquiries. But the point here is that the emphasis on planning in the recommendations of those royal commissions and national inquiries has become stronger and stronger, but still limited to what we call statutory planning. You know, whether this house can go there or that kind of development can go there, but not enough appreciation that planning can play a preventative role about where the next future urban growth corridor will go, where will the major infrastructure go on the edge of our cities particularly. I can't go through all of these in detail, so I'll just quickly move on. Establishing risk, we found that through the focus groups, quite different perceptions about fire risk, how people perceive fire in the Mornington Peninsula is very different to how people perceive fire in places like Darwin. In Darwin and the Northern Territory particularly, a long history of living with fire, whereas places like Canberra and Victoria have very major fires affecting human settlements. There's much more of a, well, how do we stop this fire? How do we stop the fire? And so that seemed to have quite a big influence on planning practitioners. So how the community and how that the broader decision makers perceive fire risk either enables or inhibits planning intervention, if you like. And so that context became really important. Just moving on to the next slide for the second part of the outcomes. Still we find that, or the focus group, I should say, they really made this point, decision makers still find it very hard to say no to the development. And so we do continue to build and rebuild again and again in areas in the context of climate change, potentially much higher risk. Now that, as Michael pointed out, may well be a community decision from a whole range of perspectives, much more than just risk. But that is an issue and a debate that still has to occur, I would suggest, in the community, the broader community. The key themes, as I mentioned right at the beginning, from the 4 focus groups were about risk, governance and management. And so you'll see that it's very consistent, those 3 themes, very consistent with the presentations from Blythe and presentations from Michael. And in many ways, it's not that people aren't trying their best, but for many practitioners and professionals, solving the issue of fire risk is really well beyond just one area of profession. And so inevitably it leads to that conclusion that, which we hear often, but it's very hard to practice, we need much greater partnerships and much greater collaboration between science, the scientists and the researchers, and the practitioners and the community in trying to resolve these issues. Which really comes down to the final point here, which is about capacity building across the nation. We have a different planning system in a statutory sense in each state and each jurisdiction in Australia. That brings problems in itself, and then we have a whole raft of local governments trying to grapple with these issues on their own, and then we have the emergency management sector overlaid on top. So we need, I think, coming through this, perhaps a national program about building capacity, understanding these planning systems and these connections with emergency management that can be tailored for each of the jurisdictions. So again, that whole question of partnerships between institutions, academics, professionals, and communicating the risks and working out local solutions. Thank you, Tanya. I should just before I finish, I have the research team. It's my last slide, sorry. I'm only one of 4 people in this team. I was the CI, but Jessica Weir really did most of the work for the focus groups. The Bushfire CRC were involved, Lindsay Wright particularly, and myself both present there. Kate Sullivan did the review of all the 16 inquiries, and Jackie Lavis did a review of the education and training program. So it was a team effort here. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you, Barbara. It's always good to give credit where credit is due. That brings us to our questions. And as promised, Simon, we'll start with your question. How does this integrate with the building code for bushfire-prone areas, if at all, given those standards are designed to minimise damage to property or loss of life?
Well, it's a very good question about we going straight to the building code, and that's, I can exactly see where that's coming from, Simon. So we can have a raft of policies, we can have a raft of legislation. I can talk about planning policies, and there's plenty of those. But at the end of the day, people want to know what they can actually do on the ground, what they can build. And that requires a connection between building regulation and planning policy. We do have a national building code, and that's a very good start in this country. We don't have a national planning system, so that's problematic. How do we integrate? I think just really repeating what I just said, those involved in designing those building codes, those who sit on the National Building Code Commission, need to be talking actively to the Institution of Engineers, the Planning Institute of Australia, and making sure that we do have that strong connection there. And whilst I know that happens, we can always do a great deal more.
Just very quickly, and I know that this is one of those pot-stirring questions, with escalating risk from climate change, will we ever be in a position where we can say no to development?
I think we will, and I think it's the head of emergency management in Australia often uses this phrase, Mark Crosweller, there's an inevitability, but it will take time. And as we know, we've had 16 major inquiries. We've had a raft of very extreme events in this country with loss of life in the last 5 years. So I think we know what the consequences are, but to get actual change through our parliamentary systems, it does take time. But I do think there'll be a point where the pressure from the insurance agencies, from the financial institutions, so in a sense the economic drivers in this country, as well as the social community drivers, along with the professions and the inquiries, will come to a point where the community will say the cost is too high. Collectively, it's too high to be agreeing to more developments or a new growth area into that bushland environment. So I do think that will happen, but I think it will take another 5 to 10 years for that to occur.
Certainly challenging. Actually, David continues on that theme. Are you suggesting that decision makers should refuse to allow building or rebuilding in bushfire-prone areas? And if so, how do you define a bushfire-prone area?
Well, that's exactly, David, you're really going to the core of the debate that will need to happen. It's not as if we haven't done this before in Australia and done it very successfully. When I was a young planner, when I say we, use the word we again, I was working for the Victorian government at the time as a planner, and we actually made a decision to buy the whole face of Mount Dandenong to stop development of that in the future. It's been subdivided by a British title subdivision from the far very many years ago, and if it had all been built, we would have really had a big disaster on our hands. If anyone knows that fire risk, and the front of that Mount Dandenong is very significant. So we have acquired land in the past, and in that context actually was very sensible because it was acquired before development had occurred at all. So that comes back to that strategic planning approach about identifying areas of risk beforehand and not after the fact. Where people already own land and they feel they have a development right and they can understand exactly where that's coming from, I think that we are beginning to see some solutions, maybe not in the fire area, but certainly in flood-prone areas, certainly in areas of risk in the Gippsland coast, on the along the coastline there in part in central Gippsland on the coast. We certainly have also acquired land there. And of course, another context is very quickly we've shifted whole towns when we built the Snowy River system. And so we have done these things before. I think we just haven't really done it in a fire risk area. And so I think that will be challenging, but I think, to ask for my professional views, I think that's when will come.
Very challenging. Well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you, Barbara. Now, before we hear from our lead end user, we're going to have an opportunity to have a quick poll question. This poll is, this time it's a multiple choice one, so you'll have an opportunity to answer more than one option if you so wish. So tell us, and this is not a firm commitment we're asking you to make, it's more give us a feel of the ways in which you could begin to use what you've heard today. Do you think you will discuss and share this with colleagues and stakeholders, use the findings to inform policy and practice in my organisation, advocate for more resources for my organisation, or learn more about how I can apply this work to my role? And we'll give it a few more seconds. And we'll leave it there. The purpose of the poll is to gauge your thoughts and to give us a sense of what they are on the implications of this research. It's interesting to see the mix there, that there's a combination of both internal things, sharing and discussing this with stakeholders, but also external as well, like advocating for more resources. So I think it's important to note that there are multiple ways in which people can and hopefully will use this. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our fourth presenter. Mick Ayre is a lead end user. He's from the Country Fire Service, South Australia. Welcome, Mick. Now, do you have any particular comments to make on both the poll results and also our early research presentation?
Yeah, thank you, Tanya, and good afternoon to everybody. Very interesting questions. I'm glad I didn't have to answer most of those, and they are very complicated in times.
I'm sure we'll have more for you, Mick.
We probably will. Look, from these excellent research outcomes that we've seen over the last few months, from an emergency service perspective, from an end user, there are some seminal matters, I think, that are important for the emergency services to address in the near future. Blythe told us basically that she can pretty well confirm the perception that most emergency services agencies have in any case, that community now wants to be engaged in emergency management decisions at all levels, and that means we need to actually understand community needs and engage with the community, but that isn't a simple process. We're not just talking about going and talking to about emergency management issues in the community. We're talking about policy, legislation, and this requires significant engagement with the community. But we also have an identified responsibility to work with communities to evaluate the risks with that community and help them understand and evaluate the level of risk in that community, and seek community views as to what they value more highly for protection during disasters, etc. In Barbara's presentation, I think she made it very clear that disaster mitigation is a stronger focus today in land use planning, and end users have particular opportunity at the moment to be better engaged in that process, to help influence decision making, and, as David suggested, help define what constitutes, in this case of his question, what is a bushfire prone area. Sounds simple, isn't as simple as it might first appear. And finally, I think in Michael's research, he's made it abundantly clear that what we really do need to see is the objectives of government and the community regarding emergency management legislation and policy having better definitions so that we can understand what constitutes success in our assistance to the community. And finally, in post-incident reviews, lead end users or end users need to work more closely with governments and, in this case, of course, the judiciary, to move beyond the response for inquiries to criticise the responders and assist in guiding those reviews and inquiries that in the context that decisions are made are usually highly dynamic and information-poor environments. So these are the sort of things that I think have come out of the research by the three projects.
Yeah. There was actually a question that Sally posted earlier that I think you, as a lead end user, you'd be in a position to answer. She asked, how might shared responsibility behaviour be reinforced or rewarded? You know, we're very quick to identify where things have gone wrong, but how might we identify and reward where things have been done well?
That's a very good question. I think the answer to that basically is to be engaged with the community, have the end users working alongside the community as part of that community, so that people actually are involved in the planning, the policy, the legislative drivers, the opportunities to make change, to assist the agencies in understanding that from time to time change will be required, and working with end users to ensure that that does happen. That probably means far more consultation with the community, but not necessarily in the way that we've traditionally seen consultation, which is effectively going out there and listening to their views. I think we need more people involved in making our management decisions. We need more people involved in actually framing our policy within our agencies, so that we understand that the impacts of the operational decisions that we make are going to be known before we make them effectively, because we've understood what our community is actually valuing in that process.
So it's a very much an engaged process. Well, that's about all we've got time for. Thank you, Mick. Before we conclude today, we're now going to have one more poll question. We're going to revisit our earlier poll to see how much we've learned today. So, how much do you think you understand about shared responsibility and the way fire risk is incorporated into legislative frameworks and policy and planning processes? And we'll give a few seconds more. And we'll leave it there. Well, that's always nice to see when the bulk of the bell curve starts to shift towards the greater knowledge area. So thank you all for listening. Now we're going to invite our earlier presenters all back to the screen now so that we can have some final thoughts. But to kick off, there was one question that Jill asked earlier that I'd like to give Michael an opportunity to answer, because it was a very good question. What does the black box that would magically fix the issues look like to you, Michael?
I think that is a good question, and the answer is that I don't have a black box or even know what it would look like, because it comes back to this question of what exactly are the issues, and as Nick said, what are the measures of success? We talk about shared responsibility and building community resilience, but we're still not quite sure what it is we're trying to achieve. Some people might say the objective has to be that no one will ever die in a bushfire, and that would lead to a very different outcome, a very different black box, than if the outcome that we're trying to achieve, for example, is that people understand the risks they're living with and are actively managing them and accepting them. So we need, that's what the whole community, I'm loath to say community engagement, because as Blythe said, it's more than that, but understanding the community, understanding the competing priorities, understanding what communities value is essential. And only when you've done that can you then begin to think about how you would fix the issues that arise in that community. I think the answer is there isn't a single issue. There isn't a single, what we're trying to achieve is this, and this is how we get there. I think that's actually really the crucial outcome of all the research, that this is a really complex, multifaceted area, and sometimes the question is posed as if it's not, as if what we want to achieve is clear, and it isn't.
So I guess in a way what we're looking for is not sort of a path from A to B, but really a whole map of the area with different views and different perspectives.
And I think that's what Blythe is referring to when she talks about the different models of governance.
Well, that's all we've got time for. We'd like each of you to give us a final thought on perhaps that poll that showed the understanding of the research presented today, or a take-home thought from what you've presented today, starting with Blythe as our first speaker. Any take-home messages that you'd like to leave with the audience?
I guess to sum up, I would say to have shared responsibility between government and citizens, we need to have shared influence, and particularly to have citizen perspectives influence that agenda-setting phase or problem-defining phase of that policy cycle.
So I guess in a way what we're looking for is not sort of a path from A to B, but really a whole map of the area with different views and different perspectives. And I think that's what Blythe is referring to when she talks about the different models of governance. Michael, your number one key point?
Is that the law isn't actually the fundamental barrier to achieving whatever the objectives are. Part of it is not quite knowing what they are. So to pick up again what Blythe just said, is once you've gone through that sort of process, then think of the law as a tool that can be used to achieve the objectives rather than defining them or being a barrier to them. The law is something we can use to achieve what we need to achieve.
So the law is a tool. Thank you. Barbara?
Minimising risk through effective land use management is a clear message. But in the context of climate change, the projected impacts of climate change, that risk will increase. So we're not necessarily managing effectively now. We need to get on top of it, and we need these partnerships and collaboration to really underpin any future action.
So the challenge is only getting greater. And Mick, as lead end user, you get the final say.
Thank you, Tanya. Look, I think from an end user perspective, the most important issue for us is to ensure that we actually have a mechanism to utilise the research and to implement the findings of this type of high quality research that can help agencies in their business and operational outcomes. So I think that's the most important issue for us.
Well, that brings today's forum to a close. We'd like to thank the presenters, Mick, Michael, Blythe and Barbara, for their involvement, and of course to you, the audience, for your questions and your input and for listening to us today. We encourage you to visit the website at www.bushfirecrc.com, where in the coming days we'll make today's presentations and video available. And there's also online related reports and fire notes that can also be found on the website. Do encourage your colleagues who might have missed out today to log on and watch the forum at a later date when it becomes available. Also, we've got a brief exit survey, so if you've got a few minutes, please do stay online and fill out the survey. We'd appreciate the feedback so that we can improve coming forums. Our next webinar forum will be What Are You Telling Us on Communication and Community Engagement, and that will be on July the 29th, and shortly we'll update the details for that on the Bushfire CRC website, so do keep an eye on that. You can also leave a comment in the exit survey if you'd like to be included in the mailing list for future online forums. On behalf of the Bushfire CRC Research to Drive Change project and its partners, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.